There's discussion of the phoenix and the turtle. Does he really love Elizabeth?
Now this, steps over into Prince Tudor theory, which I am very intrigued by, but I'm agnostic about it. I'm certain that he and the Queen had an affair.
Hey Oxfordians, it's Phoebe De Vere. On this channel, we explore the legacy of Edward De Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who wrote the works of William Shakespeare under a pen name. Welcome to part 3 of my conversation with Robert Prechter, author of Oxford's Voices, which Shakespeare wrote before he was Shakespeare. In this segment, we discuss tantalizing clues throughout Edward de Vere's corpus that he and Queen Elizabeth may have had a romantic relationship in the 1570s. Thanks for watching, and for more about Bob's work, including free samples, check out oxfordsvoices.com.
All right, I'm excited to get into our third topic. Did Edward de Vere's writings under Voices, besides the pen name William Shakespeare, did they offer any evidence that he might have had a romantic relationship with Queen Elizabeth?
I think there's some evidence that Oxford and Elizabeth had an affair sometime in the 1571 to 1574 period. This was one of the gems that came out of a decision I made to read all of the collections, the compendiums of poems. I think there are 5 or 6 or even more if you include some of the manuscripts. And
I'll start off. There's a lot of very boring, straightforward historical evidence, such as, contemporary accounts and people indicating that there's funny business going on. Mary Queen of Scots writes a letter. There's all these court witnesses who say that who's winking at it? Who winketh at it? Is it Lord Burleigh winketh at it? Or
yeah, I think he might have written that. But regardless, there's talk. And then there are the actions. He suddenly bolts for the continent in 1574 without permission. Something happened. They broke up. They got angry. And then, of course, he got permission to leave for a full year in 1575, 1576. On June 5th, 1577, Thomas Proctor, who's collecting a bunch of poems of the day, registers a book. And it's interesting because the title it was registered under is not the title it was published under. And it was registered as A Handful of Hidden Secrets. It wasn't published till 1578, so there, several months went by between the registration and the publication, but it did come out in 1578, retitled as A Gorgeous Gallery of Gallant Inventions by Diverse Worthy Workmen. So I'm plowing through this thing, and I'm going, yeah, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him. And all of a sudden I'm going, oh my God, he's jumping off the page. So we got 3 poems. One is by Rufus, a young gentleman. He is writing, quote, a loving epistle to Lady Eliza, and that is Eliza R., an anagram, which is, of course, Elizabeth Regina. The second poem is by Narcissus, a woeful youth, to Rosanna. And, of course, that brings to mind the Tudor Rose. The last one, he doesn't mention anybody's name, by a lover forsaken, a desperate farewell. And I think, as we'll see, that was Oxford's farewell poem about the affair. Now, can we tie it to the Earl of Oxford? We absolutely can do that. And to get you into the year of the writing, let's go over a couple of the lines from a poem we know that the Earl of Oxford wrote called The Loss of My Good Name. Help, gods, help, saints, help sprites and powers that in heaven do dwell. Help ye that are to wail, ye howling hounds of hell. Help man, help beasts, help birds and worms that on the earth doth toil, to wail this loss of my good name. So right in the middle of these poems, from A Gorgeous Gallery, we find the same words, images, and parallel constructions. The poem says, help thou Minerva, grant, I pray, some of thy learned skill. Help all ye muses 9, my woeful pen to write. Let all the furies forth that pine in hell with pain. Let all their torments come abroad. Come, wild and savage beasts, stretch forth your cruel paws. And then he's got a couple of lines to the Queen, yet for the worldly shame or for the loss of your good name. So there's really a tight connection between the 2 poems. And of course, you come across a bunch of lines that suggest political power of his beloved. And here's some lines that imply that. Who yieldeth all he hath as subject to thy will. If thou command, he doth obey. I am banished thus from thee. Thou art queen of womankind, and they all ought obey. And then he tells his own poem, fall flat to the ground before her face, and at her feet do lie. Haste not to rise again until she raise thee with her hand. That's queen-like thing. And pardon crave upon thy knee and pray her to forgive. And then one of my favorite lines here, I think it's self-identification. He tells her, the subject ox doth like his yoke when he is driven to draw. Okay, so you've got this queen-like stuff. We know the Earl of Oxford wrote it. And then there's some really intriguing stuff. He talks about my absence long, and we know, of course, Oxford was gone for a whole year. He had traveled. He begs his beloved to remember what drove him away. He doesn't reveal it, but it's really intriguing. He says, but if thou call to mind when I did part thee, Fro, what was the cause of my exile, and why I did forego the happy life I held? So he had his reasons for going, and he's trying to remind her what they were, but he won't say it out loud. And here's another pair of lines that's really interesting. He says, we've got to be discreet because the whole world is watching, as they like to chant. He writes, though Argus' jealous eyes that daily on us tend, forbid us to meet, and speech also our message for to send. He's saying we can't meet, we can't speak face to face. It's even risky to send a message because everybody's watching everything we do. Now, that's not true of the average pair of lovers in the world, but it certainly was true of the highest earl in the land and the queen. So I think all of these words are telling us what's going on. And I think the last poem, A Desperate Farewell, was Oxford's last entreaty to the Queen. It was probably written in 1577, just before all this was registered. And, we have to remember what he was thinking. And I think this tells us, reminds us of Shakespeare's sonnet 87, in sleep a king, but waking no such matter. I wanted to mention one other bit of language in here, too, because it relates directly to something Oxford wrote. In the first poem, he begs his beloved, let not thy friend to shipwreck go, sith thou doth hold his helm. And then in the third poem, he gives up. He says, and I thus tossed and turned, whose life to shipwreck goes. Well, that's a famous word in Oxfordian circles, because we know after the Queen died, the Earl of Oxford wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Robert Cecil, on April 27th, 1603, and he lamented, quote, in this common shipwreck, mine is above all the rest. So he had that metaphor in mind as far back as 1577, his relationship with the Queen. And when she finally died, he said, yeah, my shipwreck is complete. So I think he eventually gave up on being her lifelong companion. And it kind of makes you realize why the original title was called A Handful of Hidden Secrets.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things are coming to mind. I'm trying to figure out which thread to pick up on. I guess the first one is, I know we talked about not going too deep into this, but the Dame Lucifer anagram that you identified contains a reference to a phoenix and a turtle.
Phoenix and turtle. That's the last thing.
Okay. All right. Then I'll get out of your way then.
Okay. The next thing, at least, that came out in terms of publication, even though I think the sonnets were written earlier, was a little booklet called Sir P.S., His Astrophil and Stella. And of course, P.S. is Philip Sidney. And this was produced by Thomas Newman. Well, at the end of the book, instead of stopping with Philip Sidney's poems, he tacks on a whole bunch of extra poems. And some of them are by other people, but I think most of them are actually written by the Earl of Oxford, and they're connected to the initials S.D. A year later, out comes a sonnet sequence called Tudelia under the name Samuel Daniel. And I think it's clear from the text that what happened was not at Oxford's request. I've got a long chapter on this, but put it in the briefest possible words. I think he was working with the Countess to put out her brother's poems. One of them got hold, I think it was Oxford, got hold of Thomas Newman to do it for him. Thomas Newman, maybe he was hanging around Oxford's offices, I don't know, but he somehow got a hold of some extra sonnets that had never been published. And the book was kind of thin because Sidney didn't write that many about Astrophil and Stella. So he said, I'm going to tack on some extra stuff. Well, I think Oxford hit the roof, and you can hear it in the words addressed to the Right Honorable Lady Mary, Countess of Pembroke. It's Mary Sidney. And here's what Samuel Daniel says at the outset. Right Honorable, which, by the way, almost all the voices use that term. Although I rather desired to keep in the private passions of my youth from the multitude as things uttered to myself and consecrated to silence, yet seeing I was betrayed by the indiscretion of a greedy printer, and had some of my secrets bewrayed to the world uncorrected, doubting the like of the rest, I am forced to publish that which I never meant. It's hard to imagine the actual Samuel Daniel, getting this, upset over it. But of course, these are Oxford's private poems about himself and his affair with Queen Elizabeth, as we'll see in a minute. And so he must have paced back and forth to try to figure out what to do. And instead of just leaving there a selection of them, he figured, well, I'll do the whole thing and I'll put it in somebody else's name and nobody will ever connect it with the Queen. Sonnet 44. This is really dense. And if you'll stick with me a second, let's go through some of these lines. I think we have 7 self-references in 8 lines. And it's packed with references to Delia as someone who's a sovereign, who's a queen. He says, my Cynthia, and of course that was one of the nicknames for Queen Elizabeth, hath the waters of mine eyes. He means his tears. The ready handmaids on her grace attending, so this is like a queen who's got attendants all around, that never fail to ebb nor ever dries. So he's got never and ever in one line. For to their flow she never grants an ending, as a queen would grant a boon. The ocean never did attend more duly upon his sovereign's course, the night's pale queen, nor paid the impost, that's a tax, of his waves more truly than mine to her in truth have ever been. So he's got truly, truth, and ever in the last few words. It's packed with his own words. It's packed with that she would recognize, of course, and all these references to the fact that she's a queen. But that's not the final major clue here. There's no record of Samuel Daniel ever having traveled to Italy, but in the 1594 edition of To Delia, sonnets 42 and 44 are headed, quote, at the author's going into Italy, and the next one was, this sonnet was made at the author's being in Italy. So if Oxford wrote these, which I'm completely convinced he did, we can date the sonnets to 1575. And if we can date them to 1575, and they weren't published till 1591 without permission, it proves that Oxford never intended to have them published. Now, the other group that we looked at in Gorgeous Gallery was in somebody else's compendium. It's possible that those were never meant to see print either. As luck would have it, and our fortune would have it, Lady Fortune was working for us this time. Both of them got published. It's kind of cool. He really was in agony over all this, and I think we hear that in Sonnet 42. And I think it gives us Oxford's state of mind while he was away on the continent. And he writes this to himself. Yet go, Forsaken. By the way, remember, Forsaken was the name of the poet,
the name of the poet.
In Gorgeous Gallery in the 3rd poem. So yet go, Forsaken, in parentheses, leave these woods, these plains, leave her and all. Seek out some place, and see if any place can give the least release unto thy grief. So whatever his hopes were, they were dashed. 1575, 1577.
I remember you writing also that in the instance of the apology to Mary Sidney, you're saying this, this was my private thoughts. I didn't mean them to get out. He's also maybe even writing that for Queen Elizabeth's benefit, just in case she's
absolutely
angry, gets leaked, and so he has to be like, oh, not my fault, not my fault. No, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, I'm always wondering, does he really love Elizabeth, or is he just in his almost, his worldview, which is, as we, enumerated, is she's at the top, he's at the top, and it just makes sense. And it's almost like this kind of heartbreak and this almost like nervous breakdown that he suffers is because this thing that seems so right and just makes so much sense. Of course, I would end up with the Queen, and then it doesn't happen. I don't know. I guess we'll never know. Obviously, the feelings on his end are real, but she always seems so unpleasant. But maybe maybe he saw a different side of her.
Yeah, and think about it. He's 21 years old probably when they started flirting. Actually, one of the poems refers to how many years ago that they got together, and it actually brings you to 1569. And I thought, oh my God, was she flirting with him when he was 19? So he's really young and he's completely susceptible. She's obviously a woman of the world by this point. I mean, she was having affairs with an older man when she was 15, right? Or 14.
Younger, yeah. Her father,
Yeah,
surrogate, yeah,
Thomas Seymour.
yeah.
I can certainly imagine him at one point, and who knows what the pillow talk was, but she might have even said, you could end up being the king.
I feel like she would never have said it. I feel like she would let him think it, but she would never actually say it.
Yeah, probably wouldn't say it.
Yeah, and also, there's all this documentation of her saying like she would feel like she would look ridiculous walking around with a guy
Yeah.
so much younger, and so
Right.
End of
Yeah, he
story.
was too young.
That's just the
End of
vanity.
story. Yeah, but okay, but in his mind, he was fabulous, right? He just thought in metaphorical terms and grand terms and historical terms, and the idea that he could be king of England, I'm sure, just consumed him for at least 5 years, maybe 6, until he finally realized it was a dead end. All right, well, here's another kind of cool reference. It's about Queen Elizabeth, or at least to her, and it doesn't occur until the last two books of William Warner's Albion's England, which we talked about earlier, right? They don't come out till 1596. And Warner's, talking about English history, and he's talking about the Russians, and then he starts to weave in a tale. And it's the tale of Queen Eleanor and Mandeville, a nobleman. It's supposedly drawn from the travels of Sir John Mandeville, which was published in the 1300s. But anyway, here's the plot. An earl of noble parentage and rich becomes enamored of a lady of the royal blood, whom he calls the only phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
The queen's love is much in demand, as, quote, many mighty potentates had labored her and missed. To win the queen's attention, the earl poses as the Green Knight. And of course, green is a pun on Vere. That's where Robert Greene comes from. And he wins a jousting tournament, which the Earl of Oxford did, of course. The king gives him letters for safe conducts of the court so he can travel. And where does he go? The Earl goes to Italy,
Okay.
where he maintains his love for the queen despite detractions from these various worthy women. And Mandeville is musing because of the difference in their social station. And he says, which should I wish? Me better or you baser of degree? Be still the same you are. Well, still the same is an English rendition of Semper Idem, Queen Elizabeth's motto. Be still the same you are. Let me exile myself forever. Well, the cool thing about this is that Warner's story has a happy ending. To the surprise of her subject, the queen departs for Italy and marries the earl in Rome. It's like the first version of King Lear. The first version of King Lear ends well, as a happy ending. So he took the tragedy of his life and he gave it a happy ending in here. And I'm sure he was telling the queen, who was reading all these books, because obviously she had to get to book 12 to find out where she fit in at the end. And she reads this story of what his deepest wish would have been.
I mean, that reminds me of like Pericles and Hermione coming back to life as the statue. A lot of tragedies undone by the Earl of Oxford's.
That's the Winter's Tale. Is that the Winter's Tale?
Yeah, Winter's Tale is the king banishes the faithful wife.
Oh yeah.
She
That's
becomes
ancestral and all that. Yeah. And these things have been completely overlooked. People haven't really read William Warner, and if they did, they certainly don't get all the way to book 11 and 12. And if they do, they don't see what's going on. And this is why you need the whole context of Oxford's Voices. Yes, it's a long book, but
this is why you got to buy the book. Like I'm telling you, like high up people are saying, like, you got to check if you think that you have an idea, you want to do research on the Earl of Oxford. Don't be caught with your pants down. Don't not get up to speed on the most up to date research that indicates that there's just so much more knowledge out there, and everyone should avail themselves of it because Bob's done such beautiful work.
One thing I have to say I'm feeling good about, even though not that many people have read the book because it's long and it takes a commitment, but it's so fun. The people that have expressed skepticism, I believe every last one of them has not read it.
I believe that as well.
But
and I also think that
ones who have read it, usually say this is great. I love it. So
I also think that despite maybe the people who've read the whole thing is a small number of people, I think that the influence and just the idea of Oxford's voices theory, I see like penetrating throughout the community, and the next generation of Shakespeare scholarship is going to be built on the foundation of your work because there's so much more to
well, I
learn
hope so, but
about it.
I'm feeling very neglected. I think most people are just going, that sounds a little far fetched to me. I'm not going to bother. I mean, send me an email saying you don't like it and I want my money back. I'd be happy to send it to you. I mean, this is not a money making deal. I want people to love it. So yeah, if you want to get in there, you have to be a serious person. You have to care about this subject. So yeah, I certainly hope people will give it a shot.
I do as well, and I think that's sometimes where it
It's a
counts.
pretty small group that cares, deeply about this subject. So yeah, I certainly hope people will give it a shot. I've got one more comment to make because you had brought up at one point, what about Robert Chester's Love's Martyr? This was published in 1601, and I think it's his last major follow-up about the story of Oxford and the Queen. The subtitle is allegorically shadowing the truth of love in the constant fate of the phoenix and the turtle. Now, it's kind of interesting. One section covers King Arthur. We talked about him when we were talking about Thomas Hughes's play, right? So there's another treatment of King Arthur in this. And at least three Oxfordians, William Plumer Fowler, Dorothy Ogburn, and Daniel Wright, independently proposed that Love's Martyr is about Oxford as the turtle. Turtle means turtle dove, a bird, kind of a lovey-dovey bird. Elizabeth, who's the phoenix, obviously, that's one of her nicknames, and Southampton, who's rarity. Now, this, steps over into Prince Tudor theory, which I am very intrigued by, but I'm agnostic about it. I'm certain that he and the Queen had an affair. So what resulted from that, I'm less certain about.
You tell me, who is your daddy and what does he do? Get it? Okay, we start right here.
Point being, this is yet another publication that allegorically alludes to Oxford and Elizabeth. And of course, near the end, which is the reason everybody knows about this book, is there's a poem by William Shakespeare, which people have titled The Phoenix and the Turtle. And the most interesting line in it to me is when he speaks of this turtle and his queen. And I think he's being literal there.
Yeah, again, part of why I wanted you to answer this prompt is I do think that there's so much more information available for people who are interested in Prince Tudor theory, either for or against, or just, again, the history of this really fascinating relationship, which was so formative for Edward De Vere. There's so much more in your book that people can interpret as they will. And I think, honestly, we've just kind of done the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more I'm thinking about, and we won't go into this, but, John God's poem, Zelia and Virile, and Emeric Dolphy also referring to a phoenix and a turtle dove, and it just goes really
Let me
deep.
interject one thing.
Sure.
Of course, I had mentioned that I have all these discussions of independent writers and why I think they're independent. But as another indication, I think, of how carefully I tried to do only my own work, is that in the summation, which is the last chapter in the book and lists all of the things I think he wrote, all of the narrative poems, all the sonnet sequences, all the plays, all the prose stories, and so forth, chronologically. I also have a list, which is currently lists 116 works that various Oxfordians have attributed to Oxford that I do not think he wrote. And I cover all the reasons in each one of their respective chapters of why I don't think he wrote them. So I didn't take anyone's word for anything. All of this I tried to make my own decision about. And then at least 3 times, I think, others have come up with voices. And they said, I think Oxford wrote this. And I look at it and I go, damn, they're right. And I put a new chapter in and I credit them for it. And that was really cool to see.
I'll also plug, if people are interested in getting involved in the Oxford's Voices fan community, they can join the Oxford's Alanims Facebook group, where there's kind of an active discussion going on about Bob's work and trying to expand it and carry it forward. I'm always just in awe getting to spend time with this magnum opus that you created, and just how much more it teaches us about Edward De Vere and his life, his agonies and ecstasies and frustrations and monkey shines and capers and all of it. Just you see his habits, like you kind of feel his heartbeat next to you as you're reading the book, because you see how his time was spent. You don't just see these finished products. You really see how he was training his memory, how he was pranking people, how he was trying to keep up with the Joneses and stay afloat financially and participate in world affairs. And, you've just given such a beautiful picture of this extraordinary man and how he spent his days. And I think you deserve so much for it. So there's going to be a long comets trail of people who find your work and bring something new to it and get so much.
Well, one thing might be worth mentioning as well. We've talked about a little bit about how he might have felt about this and that, but none of that is in the book. And I mean, a lot of treatises I've read say Oxford must have thought this, or must have been angry about that, or this or that. I don't do any of that anywhere in there. My whole goal is, did he write this or not? So I was very clinical, I think, although I really think every third page is something really fun just because of what is being revealed.
I laughed out loud many times. Yeah.
But once you're done, then you can start talking about how he might have felt about this or that, because you get closer and closer to a life that had a narrative. So, I mean, I think you have done a lot to kind of bring that out, which I did a lot less of. But it's fun to speculate a bit. Once you put the evidence together in a certain order, it kind of like, well, obviously you must have felt a certain way about it.
I think you're selling yourself short. I found the book to be really full of life and whimsy and personality bursting from it, and your own voice, which is accessible and fun and funny.
Yeah, I like to entertain when I can, and because I'm not very entertaining as a person, but I think the material is entertaining. It's just so cool. Every now and then you get a smile on your face. It's because of the material.
Oh my God, it's like a gust of wind, of like just his little quirks and habits and things that he would have been angry about. And again, this is a world that is often encoded, like, you know what I mean? Like the entire Elizabethan Renaissance, almost nothing is as it appears. 70% of the writing at the time was pseudonymous. And it's like the difference between seeing the White House press correspondent giving something versus what was actually going on behind the scenes. There's just always a story behind the story, and you've done so much to uncover what those stories are.
Well, one of the things I love about him, and a lot of people love about him, is Shakespeare's sense of humor, and you find that time and again throughout the canon, he's expressing humor. You don't find that, for example, in Marlowe.
"'Tis not I who penned this dreadful play. 'Twas Christopher Marlowe."
Nay.
Yes, it was.
Marlowe's as serious as a knife in the back the whole time, He doesn't bring humor at all, but virtually every play that I think Oxford wrote, and it's about twice the Shakespeare canon, has humor. It's great. It's part of his personality. And that was pretty rare back then. I mean, I don't think Burleigh told a lot of jokes, or Francis Walsingham told a lot of jokes, or the Earl of Leicester was a jolly guy. So, I mean, he was a misfit in more than one way. He loved life, I think.
Yep. And he was an innovator in not just drama and poetry, but prose and music publishing and song lyrics and so much.
We had a whole section on songwriters, and I was watching a video online, and this guy who's a scholar of music said, one of the most interesting periods is around 1600. And his interviewer said, well, why is that? He said, well, in the late 1590s and the early 1600s, it's like somebody discovered music publishing. And I think Oxford was intimately involved with that, especially with John Dowland. Everybody thinks Dowland wrote a lot of songs. I don't think he wrote any songs at all. I think he was the best lutenist of his day, and Oxford brought him his songs to be scored and to be played and that sort of thing. And as soon as Oxford dies, suddenly John Dowland doesn't seem to be able to write a song again. That was kind of interesting.
I'm obsessed with John Dowland and Oxford and the Essex's Gaillard and the implications of those lyrics. So I guess we're just teasing people at this point.
Yeah.
Well, we'll wrap it up here. I think we have to continue and have more conversations like this, because I think it is so important for people to have access to your thoughts and ideas and to be intrigued to dive deeper. There's a lot of free samples and other content available on your website, oxfordsvoices.com.
Oh, tons of stuff. I've got articles, I've got videos, and tons of free stuff. You could spend a day or two there without spending a penny. And if you none of it convinces you, then don't buy it.
Yeah, so I'd encourage people to check out those free resources. However, there's nothing that can substitute just buying the whole book, because then you have this searchable living compendium library that shows these incredible connections between every single person in the Elizabethan world and milieu. So I often avail myself of that as a resource, and it's just great to have. It's really the definitive Oxford encyclopedia.
Well, I also want to say the Oxfordian movement is much pleasantly augmented by your presence. You've got a lot of energy. You got a lot of positive energy. You don't get caught up in, these petty disputes that some people want to get into. Your whole thrust is to get more and more people interested, and for good reasons. A lot of people in the Oxfordian movement, I used to be one of the younger people in it. Well, now I'm an old guy, so there are a lot of older people in the movement, and we need some more young people with that fresh approach that you bring. So I hope you keep it up too. And thanks for giving me a forum. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bob. I had so much fun, and I really am so excited for people to hear what you have to say more and more and read the book. And I can't wait to continue the conversation. So thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. We'll do it again sometime, maybe.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and follow me on TikTok as Phoebe De Vere. For more on Bob's work, visit oxfordsvoices.com or follow Oxford's Voices on YouTube.